I remember the moment because it felt almost embarrassing. Someone asked a simple question that should have had a simple answer. Did Jesus actually say, "I am God, worship me"? You expected to remember the verse immediately. After all, if one of the central beliefs of Christianity is that Jesus is God, surely there must be one unmistakable sentence where he says exactly that. But the more you searched, the more uncomfortable the silence became. Not because the question proved anything by itself, but because you suddenly realized how often we inherit conclusions before we examine the path that supposedly leads to them. That feeling is strangely familiar in every part of life. We assume our family recipes are the best because they are our family recipes. We defend our hometown because it is ours. We think our favorite sports team has the most loyal fans because we grew up surrounded by them. Identity quietly writes conclusions before evidence even enters the room. Religion is no exception. In fact, it may be one of the strongest examples. Long before most people ever open a sacred text, they already know what they expect to find inside it. If you grow up in a Christian environment, you often hear that Jesus claimed to be God. If you grow up in a Muslim environment, you hear that he never did. If you grow up with no religion at all, you may assume the entire discussion is meaningless. Each group feels that its position is obvious, yet the remarkable thing is that all three cannot be correct in exactly the same way. Somewhere, assumptions have entered the conversation. The uncomfortable question is not whether Jesus was divine. That is ultimately a theological conclusion. The uncomfortable question is much narrower. Did Jesus himself explicitly claim to be God in language that leaves no room for debate? At first glance, many people think the answer is obviously yes. Others think it is obviously no. But history has a habit of refusing to cooperate with obvious answers. One of the hardest lessons about truth is that reality often lives between slogans. Human beings love certainty because certainty feels safe. Ambiguity forces responsibility. Once you discover that intelligent historians, theologians, philosophers, and biblical scholars have debated this question for centuries, you lose the luxury of pretending that only ignorant people disagree. Suddenly the conversation becomes more interesting. Instead of asking what your pastor believes or what your favorite internet personality insists, you begin asking what the earliest sources actually say. That shift changes everything, because now the discussion is no longer about loyalty. It becomes about reading carefully. One psychological habit quietly shapes nearly every controversial conversation. We rarely notice what is absent because we are busy interpreting what is present. Think about everyday life. Imagine your friend constantly hints that he wants you to help him move next weekend. He says he is overwhelmed. He mentions heavy furniture. He talks about renting a truck. Eventually you understand exactly what he wants, even if he never says the words directly. Human communication works that way all the time. Meaning is often implied rather than explicitly stated. But here is the problem. Sometimes we infer correctly. Sometimes we project our expectations into vague statements. Those two possibilities are easy to confuse. That is why this question has endured for so long. Supporters of Jesus' divinity often point to passages where he forgives sins, accepts worship, identifies himself with divine authority, or makes statements that many readers interpret as placing himself alongside God. Critics respond that none of those necessarily amount to an explicit declaration that he is God in the later theological sense developed by Christian doctrine. Both sides are reading the same documents. Both sides notice different details. That should immediately slow down anyone who thinks the issue can be settled with one sentence. Consider another uncomfortable reality. The earliest followers of Jesus lived inside a deeply Jewish world where belief in one God was foundational. For them, language about God carried enormous weight. If Jesus was understood as sharing in God's identity, that would have been an extraordinary claim requiring careful interpretation. Some scholars argue that this is exactly what happened. Others argue that later, Christian reflection gradually expressed beliefs about Jesus with greater theological precision than the historical Jesus himself may have articulated. Notice something important here. This is not the same as saying Christianity invented Jesus out of thin air. It is about distinguishing between historical reconstruction and theological development. Those are different conversations, although people often mix them together because separating them requires patience. Patience is one of the first casualties of ideological conflict. We prefer headlines. We like videos promising to destroy an entire religion in 15 minutes or prove everything with one secret verse. Reality rarely cooperates with those promises. Imagine walking into a courtroom where one lawyer presents only evidence supporting guilt, while another presents only evidence supporting innocence. If you listen to just one side, the verdict would feel obvious. Only after hearing both arguments would you recognize how selective each presentation had been. Confirmation bias is not merely believing false things, it is filtering reality until only familiar conclusions survive. Every human being does it. Religious people do it, skeptics do it, historians do it. The difference lies in whether we are willing to notice ourselves doing it. When people discuss Jesus' identity, many conversations collapse because they begin with the conclusion instead of the evidence. Someone already believes Jesus is God, so every difficult saying becomes proof. Someone already believes he cannot possibly be God, so every passage suggesting otherwise must be explained away. The text becomes secondary. Identity takes the driver's seat. That should make all of us uncomfortable because it reveals something deeper than this single debate. It exposes how the human mind protects belonging. We fear isolation more than we fear error. Imagine discovering that your deepest convictions place you outside your family, your community, or your lifelong friendships. That possibility alone creates enormous psychological pressure. Most people sincerely believe what they believe, but sincerity is not immunity from social influence. You probably did not choose your first language after comparing every language on earth. You inherited it. The same is true for many assumptions about religion. None of this tells us whether Christianity is true or false. It simply reminds us that inherited confidence deserves examination. Now consider one of the most discussed passages. In the Gospel according to John, Jesus declares that before Abraham was, I am. Many Christians see this as an intentional echo of the divine name revealed in the Hebrew Scriptures. They point to the strong reaction from some listeners as evidence that they understood the statement as blasphemous, because it implied equality with God. Other scholars agree that the language is highly significant, but argue that interpreting exactly how the original audience understood it remains debated. Some suggest it expresses unique divine authority or pre-existence without necessarily functioning as the straightforward sentence modern readers often expect. The disagreement is not about whether the verse exists, it is about what it means. Meaning is rarely extracted by reading one sentence in isolation. It depends on literary context, historical background, and theological perspective. Another example often discussed involves Jesus forgiving sins. Within the gospel narratives, some religious leaders respond by asking who can forgive sins except God alone. Christians frequently argue that Jesus deliberately exercises a divine prerogative. Others respond that prophets and representatives of God can announce forgiveness without claiming to be God themselves. Again, the disagreement lies in interpretation rather than the existence of the story itself. You may notice a pattern emerging. Almost every major argument revolves around implications instead of explicit formulas. That observation alone explains why the debate has survived for centuries. If there were a universally acknowledged sentence saying, exactly I am God, in the modern theological sense, the historical discussion would look very different. Instead, scholars analyze actions, titles, symbolism, literary themes, and the development of early Christian belief. Some conclude that Jesus presented himself in ways that implicitly claimed divine status. Others conclude that later theological language exceeded what the historical Jesus likely intended to communicate. Both positions exist within serious scholarship. That fact may be less emotionally satisfying than choosing a side immediately, but reality is under no obligation to satisfy our desire for simplicity. Here is where psychology quietly returns. We often confuse confidence with clarity. Listen to two people passionately disagreeing online. Their certainty can be overwhelming, yet certainty is cheap. Human beings can be absolutely convinced about contradictory ideas. Confidence is a description of emotion, not evidence. The history of science, politics, and religion is filled with people who never doubted themselves. Some were right, some were catastrophically wrong. The feeling of certainty cannot tell you which category you belong to. That realization is deeply humbling because it removes one of our favorite shortcuts. We cannot simply ask ourselves how convinced we feel. We must ask why we feel convinced and whether our reasons survive honest examination. There is another reason this topic becomes emotionally charged. For many believers, Jesus' divinity is not merely an abstract doctrine. It shapes worship, prayer, salvation, hope, and identity. Questioning how the earliest texts should be interpreted can therefore feel intensely personal. For many skeptics, exposing what they perceive as later theological development represents intellectual honesty. Both emotional investments are real. Acknowledging them does not invalidate either side. It simply reminds us that no one enters this conversation as a perfectly detached observer. We all bring hopes, fears, experiences, and assumptions. Honest thinking begins by recognizing that fact instead of pretending we float above it. The irony is that genuine faith and genuine skepticism both benefit from asking better questions instead of protecting easier answers. The person most likely to miss something important is usually the one convinced there is nothing left to learn. If conversations like this matter to you because you would rather examine difficult questions than hide from them, consider subscribing and becoming part of a community that values careful thinking over comfortable certainty. The strongest beliefs are not the ones protected from scrutiny, but the ones willing to endure it. You have probably experienced something that feels strangely unrelated to religion, but is actually at the heart of this entire discussion. Someone tells a story about an event you both witnessed. As they speak, you begin wondering whether you remember the same afternoon. They are not lying, you are not lying. Yet details that seemed obvious to one of you never even registered with the other. Memory is selective. Perception is selective. Interpretation is selective. That simple reality should permanently change the way we approach ancient texts. The people who wrote the earliest Christian documents were not trying to satisfy modern debates that would emerge centuries later. They were communicating within their own historical, cultural, and religious world. When modern readers ask, "Did Jesus literally say the exact sentence, 'I am God'?" they are asking a question shaped by 21st century expectations. Ancient writers often communicated identity through actions, symbols, titles, and narratives, rather than through the kind of systematic doctrinal statements modern audiences expect. That does not answer the question by itself, but it explains why the conversation is more complicated than many people imagine. One of the greatest mistakes we make when reading history is assuming people from 2,000 years ago argued the same way we argue today. They did not. They spoke through imagery, allusions, and references their original audiences immediately recognized, but which modern readers often miss. Imagine reading a political cartoon from another country without knowing any of the politicians involved. You would see the drawing, but much of the meaning would escape you. Ancient religious literature can work the same way. This is why historians spend years studying language, culture, and historical context before drawing conclusions. Not because complexity is impressive, but because context changes meaning. Consider the title Son of God. Today, many people immediately interpret that phrase as a direct statement of divinity. Yet within the ancient world, the title had multiple uses. Kings could be described this way. Israel as a nation could be described this way. In some contexts, it expressed a unique relationship with God rather than literal equality with God. At the same time, many Christian theologians argue that the way the New Testament ultimately presents Jesus gives this title a depth unlike any previous use. The important point is that the phrase itself does not automatically settle the debate. Its meaning depends on how it functions within each specific passage and within the broader narrative. The same is true for another famous title, Son of Man. To modern ears, it sounds almost humble, emphasizing humanity. Yet many scholars note that this title echoes imagery from the Book of Daniel, where a mysterious figure receives authority, glory, and an everlasting kingdom from God. Some Christians see Jesus' use of this title as one of his strongest implicit claims about his identity. Others argue that the expression could carry several meanings and should not automatically be equated with a direct declaration of deity. Again, interpretation matters. This pattern repeats throughout the Gospels. The discussion is rarely about whether the words exist. It is about what those words communicated to the original audience. This is where psychology becomes surprisingly relevant. Human beings dislike unresolved tension. We naturally want every difficult question to have a simple answer. If the evidence feels mixed, we instinctively search for the strongest argument supporting the conclusion we already prefer. That impulse is understandable, but it is also dangerous. Intellectual maturity often means resisting the urge to rush towards certainty. There is another layer that deserves attention. The four Gospels are not identical biographies written with identical purposes. They share many events while also emphasizing different themes. The Gospel according to Mark is generally considered by many scholars to be the earliest. The Gospel according to John presents Jesus with a noticeably different style of discourse, including longer theological conversations that have played a central role in discussions about his identity. Some historians suggest this reflects decades of theological reflection within the early Christian community. Many Christian scholars agree that the Gospel reflects profound theological reflection while still maintaining that it faithfully communicates who Jesus truly was. These are not mutually exclusive positions. Historical scholarship asks one set of questions. Theology asks another. Sometimes the answers overlap. Sometimes they emphasize different concerns. Problems arise when people assume they are always asking the same question. Imagine asking whether a painting is beautiful and whether it accurately represents the chemical composition of the paint. Both are legitimate questions, but they operate in different categories. Confusing categories creates unnecessary conflict. Another fascinating observation emerges when we look at the earliest Christian movement itself. Within only a few decades of Jesus' death, letters attributed to early Christian leaders describe him in remarkably exalted ways. Whether one believes those descriptions reflect Jesus' own self-understanding or the rapidly developing beliefs of his followers is precisely one of the major historical questions. Yet almost everyone agrees that devotion to Jesus emerged very early. The disagreement concerns why. Did his followers worship him because he explicitly presented himself as sharing God's identity? Did they gradually arrive at that conviction after experiences they interpreted as encounters with the risen Jesus? Or did theological reflection continue developing over time as the movement expanded into the wider Greco-Roman world? These questions remain active areas of scholarly discussion because the available evidence allows for competing interpretations. That may frustrate people looking for absolute certainty, but history often works that way. We reconstruct the past from surviving evidence rather than possessing a complete recording of every conversation. This uncertainty should not automatically produce skepticism, nor should it automatically produce confidence. Instead, it should produce humility. Humility is strangely unpopular because it refuses to offer emotional shortcuts. It asks us to distinguish between what we know, what we infer, and what we believe. Those three categories overlap, but they are not identical. One of the healthiest habits any person can develop is learning to say, "This is my conclusion based on the evidence I find most persuasive," while recognizing that thoughtful people may evaluate the same evidence differently. That attitude is not weakness. It is intellectual honesty. Ironically, it often requires far more courage than pretending every difficult question has already been settled. The deeper issue behind this entire conversation is not only what Jesus claimed, it is how human beings decide what counts as truth. Do we trust authority because it is familiar? Do we trust tradition because it has endured? Do we trust personal experience because it feels undeniable? Or do we carefully weigh history, language, philosophy, and evidence while recognizing the limits of each? None of those questions disappear simply because the topic is religion. In fact, religion often exposes them more clearly than almost anything else. Every person eventually discovers that inherited certainty and examined conviction are not the same thing. The transition from one to the other can feel unsettling because it forces us to confront something we usually avoid. the possibility that our deepest assumptions deserve closer examination. That examination does not require abandoning faith, nor does it require embracing disbelief. It requires something much more difficult. It requires the willingness to let evidence, context, and honest reflection challenge our instincts before our instincts reshape the evidence. That is where genuine intellectual growth begins, and it is also where the conversation about whether Jesus really claimed to be God becomes far more meaningful than a simple search for one decisive sentence. By now, the question has quietly changed. It no longer feels like a search for a single sentence hidden somewhere in an ancient manuscript. Instead, it has become a mirror. It forces you to ask how you reach conclusions, what kind of evidence you expect, and whether you apply the same standards to beliefs you already hold as you do to beliefs you reject. That is an uncomfortable place to stand because it removes the safety of easy answers. It is much easier to criticize someone else's assumptions than to investigate your own. Yet this is exactly where the discussion becomes most valuable. Imagine two people reading the same biography of a historical figure. One focuses on every statement that suggests greatness. The other notices every flaw and every ambiguity. Neither is inventing facts, but each is assembling a different picture, because each gives different weight to the available evidence. Something similar happens when people approach the Gospels. A believer may naturally see a coherent portrait pointing toward Jesus' divine identity through his words, actions, authority, and relationship with the Father. A skeptic may see a remarkable Jewish teacher whose followers gradually came to understand him in increasingly exalted ways after his death. A historian may suspend final judgment and ask which explanation best fits the surviving sources, while acknowledging that history cannot answer every theological question. These approaches are not identical because they are asking different things of the evidence. One seeks theological truth, another seeks historical probability, another seeks philosophical coherence. Confusing those goals often creates arguments in which both sides talk past each other rather than engaging the actual issue. One of the most revealing features of this debate is that it has survived for nearly 2,000 years despite the extraordinary amount of attention devoted to it. Countless scholars have learned the original languages, compared ancient manuscripts, studied archaeology, examined the historical context of first-century Judea, and analyzed every major passage relevant to Jesus' identity. If the answer were as obvious as internet debates often suggest, this conversation would likely have ended centuries ago. Instead, it continues because the evidence is rich enough to inspire conviction, yet complex enough to sustain disagreement. That fact alone should encourage intellectual humility. It reminds us that confidence should never outrun understanding. It is tempting to believe that only dishonest people disagree with us, but history repeatedly demonstrates otherwise. Intelligent, sincere, and well-informed individuals can reach different conclusions because evidence rarely interprets itself. Every reader brings assumptions, methods, and priorities to the text. Recognizing this does not mean every interpretation is equally persuasive. Some arguments are stronger than others. Some readings fit the historical context more naturally than others. But acknowledging complexity is different from surrendering to relativism. It simply means refusing to pretend that difficult questions become easy because we prefer one answer. There is another psychological insight hidden beneath this discussion. Most people fear uncertainty, not because uncertainty is inherently painful, but because it feels like losing control. If your identity has always rested on having immediate answers, then discovering unresolved questions can feel threatening. Yet uncertainty also creates the possibility of deeper understanding. The scientist who admits not knowing can investigate. The historian who recognizes gaps in the evidence can continue searching. The believer who wrestles honestly with difficult passages may develop a more thoughtful faith rather than a more fragile one. Likewise, the skeptic who resists dismissing religious claims without careful examination may discover that some assumptions deserve reconsideration. Honest inquiry works in both directions. It challenges belief and unbelief alike. The deeper lesson is that truth is rarely served by fear. Fear pushes us toward slogans because slogans eliminate complexity. They offer emotional certainty at the cost of careful thinking. but reality has never promised to fit inside slogans. Throughout history, many of the most significant discoveries began with someone willing to ask a question that others considered unnecessary or uncomfortable. The question itself was not dangerous. The refusal to examine it was. Whether you ultimately conclude that Jesus explicitly claimed to be God, implicitly revealed a divine identity through his words and actions, or never intended such a claim at all, the process by which you reach that conclusion matters. A conclusion reached through careful examination is stronger than one inherited without reflection. That principle extends far beyond religion. It applies to politics, culture, science, relationships, and nearly every conviction that shapes our lives. We become wiser not by collecting opinions, but by learning how to evaluate them. Perhaps the most uncomfortable realization of all is that changing your mind is not always a sign that you were weak. Sometimes it is evidence that you cared more about truth than about protecting your ego. At other times, examining the evidence may strengthen convictions you already held, but now they rest on understanding rather than habit. Either outcome is healthier than believing something merely because everyone around you always has. In the end, the question, did Jesus really claim to be God, cannot be answered responsibly by a viral headline, a single isolated verse, or a 15-second clip. It requires reading entire narratives, considering historical context, distinguishing between historical evidence and theological interpretation, and recognizing where the evidence is widely agreed upon and where serious debate remains. For many Christians, the cumulative portrait of the New Testament leads convincingly to the conclusion that Jesus shares God's identity, even if he did not express it in the exact modern formula some expect. For many non-Christians and some historians, that same body of evidence suggests a different conclusion about how beliefs concerning Jesus developed over time. Understanding why those conclusions differ is often more illuminating than pretending the disagreement itself does not exist. The goal of asking difficult questions is not to tear down belief or to build skepticism for its own sake. It is to replace unexamined certainty with informed conviction. Whatever conclusion you eventually reach, let it be one you can explain, defend, and revisit with honesty, rather than one you simply inherited because it was familiar. If conversations like this challenge you to think more carefully, read more deeply, and value evidence over assumptions, then stay with us. The most worthwhile questions are often the ones that refuse to leave us unchanged.